summer 1944, a train station in Texas. The exact location was never recorded in official documents, but the story was documented in letters and testimony. Corporal Rupert Trimmingham, a black soldier in the United States Army, sat on a train during a stopover. He was traveling from his base to advanced combat training. He would soon deploy overseas to fight against Nazi Germany. He was wearing his uniform. He had his orders. He was hungry. The train would be stopped for 45 minutes, enough time to get a meal. Trimmingham walked into the station. He saw the restaurant. He approached the entrance. Then he saw the sign, whites only. He couldn't enter. He stood outside, frustrated but not surprised. This was Texas in 1944. Segregation was the law. Black soldiers, despite wearing their country's uniform, were subject to the same racial restrictions as black civilians. Trimmingham turned to walk back to the train. Then he saw something that would change his life and, eventually, contribute to changing America. A group of German prisoners of war walked past him, escorted by American guards. The German POWs wore uniforms with large PW letters painted on the back. Prisoners of war, enemy soldiers, men who had been fighting for Hitler. The guards escorted them into the restaurant. The same restaurant Trimmingham couldn't enter. The German POWs sat down at tables. They ordered food. They were served. Trimmingham watched through the window as enemy soldiers ate in a restaurant where he, an American soldier preparing to fight, those same enemies, was forbidden to enter because of his skin color. He later wrote about this experience in a letter to a magazine. The letter was published. It sparked national attention. But this was not an isolated incident. This scene repeated itself thousands of times across America during World War II. This is the story of how 400,000 Axis prisoners of war lived in America during the war, how they were treated better than black American citizens, and how this injustice helped fuel the movement that would eventually dismantle segregation. Let's start with how the prisoners got here. 1942. The United States has been in World War II for less than a year. American forces are fighting in North Africa. They're capturing German and Italian soldiers, thousands of them. The question becomes what to do with these prisoners. The Geneva Convention requires that prisoners of war be treated humanely. They must be housed, fed, given medical care, protected from combat. Britain is already holding hundreds of thousands of Axis prisoners. They don't have space for more. Britain asks the United States to take custody of prisoners captured in North Africa and later in Europe. The U.S. agrees. The War Department begins planning. Where do you house hundreds of thousands of enemy soldiers? You can't put them near the coasts. Security risk. You can't put them in major cities. Too many potential targets for sabotage. The solution is to build camps in rural areas across the South and Midwest. Places with space. Places with existing infrastructure. Places where the prisoners can be put to work to offset the cost of their captivity. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States builds over 500 POW camps. These range from large base camps holding thousands of prisoners to small branch camps holding dozens. The camps are located in 46 states. Texas has the most, with over 70 camps. Other states with large POW populations include Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, and Louisiana. The camps are built quickly. Barracks, mess halls, recreation facilities, medical clinics, guard towers, barbed wire fences. But the camps are not brutal. The Geneva Convention requires that prisoners be housed in conditions similar to the captor nation's own troops. American planners interpret this generously. The camps are clean, well-maintained, heated in winter. Many have libraries, sports fields, even theaters where prisoners can stage performances. The first large groups of German prisoners arrive in 1943. They're transported by ship across the Atlantic, then by train to the camps. When they arrive, many are surprised. They expected harsh treatment. Nazi propaganda had told them that Americans would mistreat prisoners. What they find is nothing like what they expected. The barracks are comfortable. The food is adequate. sometimes better than what German soldiers were eating in the field. Medical care is available. Prisoners are allowed to write letters home, though the letters are censored. They're allowed to receive packages. They're paid for their labor, a small wage, but something. Many German prisoners later described their time in American POW camps as the best period of the war. They were safe from bombing. They had enough to eat. They weren't being shot at. For soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front against the Soviet Union, or in North Africa in brutal desert conditions, American captivity was almost pleasant. The daily routine in the camps is structured but not oppressive. Morning roll call, breakfast, work assignments, lunch, more work, dinner, free time. Prisoners work on farms, in food processing plants, in lumber camps. American labor is scarce because so many men are in the military. The prisoners fill this gap. They're paid 80 cents per day in camp scrip that can be used in the camp canteen. They work 8-hour days, 5 or 6 days per week. The work is hard but not brutal. Farm labor, harvesting crops, logging. The German prisoners adapt to this routine. Many learn English. Some develop friendships with their guards. Some develop relationships with local civilians, particularly in rural areas where the prisoners work on farms and interact with farming families. Here's where the contrast becomes stark. These German prisoners, enemy soldiers who fought for Hitler, are allowed to move relatively freely in many communities. They work alongside American civilians. They shop in local stores using their camp, scrip or supervised by guards who make purchases for them. They attend religious services in local churches. And in many places, particularly in the South, they're treated as white men. They can enter restaurants that black Americans cannot enter. They can use restrooms marked whites only. They can sit in the front of buses. The reason is simple and ugly. In the eyes of segregationist America, these German prisoners are white. Race trumps nationality. Race trumps the fact that these men were fighting for a regime built on racial supremacy and genocide. Race trumps the fact that they are literally enemy soldiers. They are white, therefore they are afforded privileges that black American citizens are denied. This creates situations like the one Corporal Trimmingham witnessed. Black soldiers in American uniforms being denied service in restaurants where German POWs in enemy uniforms are welcomed. Black soldiers being forced to ride in the back of buses while German prisoners sit in front. Black soldiers being denied hotel rooms while German prisoners are housed in comfortable camps with recreational facilities. The irony is not lost on black Americans. Black newspapers run stories exposing these contradictions. The Pittsburgh Courier, one of the largest black newspapers, runs a headline, "Nazi prisoners get better treatment than Negro soldiers." The Chicago Defender publishes accounts from black soldiers describing discrimination they face while German POWs are treated well. The NAACP collects testimony from black service members and civilians documenting these incidents. The stories are remarkably consistent. A black soldier in Louisiana is refused service at a lunch counter. He watches German POWs eat at the same counter. A black nurse in Alabama cannot find a hotel room. The hotel is housing German prisoners working on a local farm. A black family in Mississippi cannot eat at a roadside diner. German prisoners working at a nearby camp are regular customers. These incidents accumulate. They create a growing awareness among black Americans that they are fighting a war against fascism and racial supremacy abroad, while living under a different version of the same system at home. This awareness will become the foundation of the post-war civil rights movement. But let's talk about the prisoners themselves. Who were these men? The German prisoners came from all branches of the Wehrmacht: infantry, artillery, panzer crews, Luftwaffe ground personnel. Most were captured in North Africa, Italy, or France. They ranged in age from teenagers to middle-aged men. Many were conscripts, drafted into service, not ideological fanatics. Some were dedicated followers of Hitler. Some were anti-fascists who were relieved to be captured. Most were somewhere in between, ordinary soldiers who fought because they were ordered to. In the camps, they organized themselves according to German military hierarchy. Officers lived in separate barracks and did not work. Enlisted men worked and deferred to officers. Fanatical believers in Hitler sometimes intimidated or attacked prisoners who were less enthusiastic about the regime. Camp authorities had to separate prisoners to prevent violence. Some camps held mostly convinced supporters of Hitler. Others held prisoners who were openly anti-Nazi. The Americans tried to use this division. They created re-education programs, showing films about concentration camps, distributing literature about democracy. The goal was to turn prisoners into future supporters of democracy who would return to Germany after the war and help rebuild. The programs had mixed success. Some prisoners were genuinely shocked by films showing the Holocaust. They claimed they didn't know. Some refused to believe the films, insisting it was Allied propaganda. Some didn't care about politics and just wanted to survive and go home. Now let's talk about Japanese prisoners of war. The Japanese POW experience in America was different from the German experience, but it involved similar injustices related to Black Americans. Fewer Japanese soldiers were taken prisoner. Japanese military culture emphasized fighting to the end rather than surrendering. Surrender was considered deeply shameful. As a result, American forces captured relatively few Japanese POWs in the early years of the war. The numbers increased later as Japan's position became hopeless, but total Japanese POWs held in the United States numbered only a few thousand, compared to hundreds of thousands of Germans. Japanese prisoners were generally held in separate facilities from German prisoners. Some were held at camps in the southern states, others at camps in the Midwest. The treatment was generally consistent with Geneva Convention standards, though there was more suspicion and hostility toward Japanese prisoners than toward German prisoners. This was partly due to racial prejudice, partly due to anger over Pearl Harbor, and partly due to reports of Japanese atrocities against American POWs in the Pacific. But here's the contradiction. Japanese POWs, despite being enemy soldiers, and despite widespread American prejudice against people of Japanese ancestry, were still sometimes afforded better treatment than Black American soldiers. There are documented cases of Japanese prisoners being served in restaurants where Black soldiers were refused. Cases of Japanese prisoners being housed in facilities where Black soldiers could not stay. Cases of Japanese prisoners being treated with more respect than Black Americans in uniform. This was particularly painful for Black soldiers who fought in the Pacific Theater. These men were fighting against Japan. They were risking their lives. And when they returned home or when they were stationed at bases in the American South, they were treated worse than the enemy soldiers they had been fighting. One Black veteran, whose name was recorded in oral history interviews conducted decades later, described returning from the Pacific in late 1945. His unit had fought in the Philippines. He had been wounded. He was being transported through the American South to a hospital for treatment. At a train station in Georgia, he tried to buy food at the station restaurant. He was refused service. He was told to go to the colored entrance at the back. He looked through the window and saw Japanese prisoners of war eating inside. He said, "I had just spent 2 years fighting these people. I had been wounded fighting them, and now they could eat in a restaurant where I couldn't. That's when I realized something had to change. Not someday, not eventually, now." This sentiment was widespread among Black veterans. They returned from the war with a new consciousness. They had fought for freedom. They had proven their courage and capability. They had served their country, and they were not going to accept second-class citizenship anymore, but back to the German prisoners. As the war progressed, the camps became more established. The prisoners settled into routines. Some camps developed elaborate recreational programs. Prisoners staged theatrical productions. They formed orchestras. They played soccer and volleyball. They celebrated German holidays. The camps had newspapers written by and for prisoners. Some camps had educational programs where prisoners could take classes. The treatment was humane, sometimes generous. This was partly due to American values of fair treatment, partly due to Geneva Convention requirements, and partly due to practical considerations. Well-treated prisoners were easier to manage. They caused fewer problems. They worked more productively, but it was also partly due to race. These were white prisoners. In the segregated American South, whiteness conferred status even on enemy soldiers. There are accounts of German prisoners being invited to meals at the homes of local families. Accounts of romantic relationships developing between German prisoners and American women. accounts of prisoners being treated almost as guests rather than enemies. Meanwhile, Black American soldiers faced constant discrimination. They were stationed at bases in the South where segregation was strictly enforced. They could not use facilities designated for whites. They faced hostility from local white civilians. They were sometimes attacked by white soldiers or white military police. There are documented cases of black soldiers being beaten for failing to show proper deference to white officers or white civilians. Cases of black soldiers being arrested for minor infractions that white soldiers committed without consequence. Cases of black soldiers being dishonorably discharged for protesting discrimination. The contrast between the treatment of white enemy prisoners and black American soldiers was so stark that it became a major issue. Black newspapers demanded that the government address the contradiction. Civil rights organizations filed complaints. Some members of Congress raised questions. The military's response was largely to ignore the problem. Official policy maintained segregation. Official statements claimed that black soldiers were treated fairly and that any problems were isolated incidents. But the evidence was overwhelming. Black soldiers were being treated worse than enemy prisoners. This was not isolated. This was systematic. 1945. The war in Europe ends in May. The war in the Pacific ends in August. The United States now has hundreds of thousands of German and Italian prisoners to repatriate. But there's a problem. Germany is destroyed. Much of Europe is in ruins. Where do you send these prisoners? The decision is made to keep many prisoners in the United States for another year or more to continue working. American agriculture still needs labor. The prisoners are willing to stay. Many don't want to return to Germany. They know what they'll find there. Destroyed cities, food shortages, occupation. The prisoners in American camps have comfortable lives by comparison, so they stay. They continue working on farms and in food processing. They continue living in camps. They continue being treated better than black Americans. This extends the injustice for another year. Black veterans are returning home. They've fought and won the war. They expect recognition. They expect change. What they find is the same segregation they left. Black veterans in the South are still denied basic rights. They still face discrimination. They still live under Jim Crow laws. And German prisoners, enemy soldiers, are still living comfortably in camps, still working alongside white Americans, still being treated as white men despite their enemy status. 1946. Repatriation finally begins in earnest. The German prisoners are shipped back to Europe. The camps are closed. The barracks are dismantled. The guard towers come down. The prisoners return to Germany and try to rebuild their lives. Many face harsh conditions in post-war Germany, destroyed infrastructure, Allied occupation, food shortages. Some German former prisoners maintain correspondence with American families they met during their captivity. Some eventually immigrate to the United States. They become American citizens. They integrate into American society as white immigrants. Meanwhile, black veterans are organizing. They're demanding change. They've served their country. They've proven themselves. They will not accept second-class status anymore. The NAACP grows in membership and militancy. New civil rights organizations form. Black veterans become leaders in local communities, challenging segregation, demanding voting rights, pushing for integration. The experiences of the war years, including the bitter contradiction of seeing enemy prisoners treated better than black Americans, fuel this activism. Historians later identify the World War II period as crucial to the civil rights movement. Black Americans served in large numbers. Over 1 million black Americans served in the military during the war. They served in segregated units, faced discrimination, and yet performed with distinction. They proved that the justifications for segregation were lies. And when they returned home, they had new expectations. They had organizational skills learned in the military. They had networks of fellow veterans. They had a heightened sense of injustice. The Double V campaign, Victory Over Fascism Abroad and Victory Over Racism at Home, became the framework for post-war activism. The experiences of men like Corporal Trimmingham, watching German prisoners eat in restaurants where black soldiers were refused, crystallized the contradiction. America claimed to be fighting for freedom and democracy. America claimed to oppose racial supremacy, but America practiced racial supremacy at home. This hypocrisy could not stand. Black Americans would force the country to confront it. The 1950s and 60s saw the flowering of the civil rights movement. school desegregation, voting rights campaigns, sit-ins and freedom rides. The movement had many sources: the legacy of earlier civil rights activism, the influence of black churches, the emergence of charismatic leaders. But the World War II experience was foundational. Black veterans knew they had earned full citizenship. They had fought for their country. They would not be denied their rights. And the memory of German prisoners being treated better than black soldiers became a rallying cry. How could America justify this? How could America claim moral authority in the world while treating its own citizens worse than enemy prisoners? These questions had no good answers. The only answer was change, and change came, slowly and incompletely, but it came. The military integrated in 1948 under President Truman's executive order. This was a direct result of black service in World War II. The military could no longer justify segregation when black units had fought effectively. Civil rights legislation in the 1960s dismantled legal segregation. The Voting Rights Act enfranchised black Americans. The Fair Housing Act prohibited housing discrimination. These victories were achieved through decades of struggle, but the World War II experience was a catalyst. Let's return to Corporal Trimmingham. After his letter was published, he received national attention. Some praised him for speaking out. Some attacked him. White supremacists sent threatening letters. But his story resonated. It captured the contradiction in a single image. A black soldier in American uniform standing outside a restaurant while German prisoners in enemy uniforms ate inside. That image became symbolic of the injustice black Americans faced. Trimmingham completed his military service and returned to civilian life. He became a civil rights activist. He spoke about his experiences. He participated in voter registration drives. He lived to see some of the changes he fought for. He saw segregation challenged and eventually dismantled legally, though not always in practice. He understood that the struggle was not finished, but he also understood that his generation had moved it forward. He passed away in the 1980s. His story is now taught in schools. His letter is reprinted in textbooks. He became a symbol of the black veterans who served their country and then had to fight for their rights at home. The POW camps are long gone. The barracks were dismantled. The land returned to other uses. Some camps are now historical sites with markers explaining what happened there. Visitors can learn about the prisoners who lived there, the work they did, the lives they led. But what's often missing from these historical sites is the context. The fact that these prisoners were treated better than black Americans. The fact that enemy soldiers had privileges that American citizens were denied. The fact that this injustice helped fuel a movement that changed America. That context is crucial. Without it, the POW camp story is incomplete. It becomes a story about humane treatment of prisoners, about following the Geneva Convention, about American generosity. And those elements are part of the story. But the full story includes the contradiction. America treated enemy prisoners humanely while denying humanity to its own black citizens. That contradiction reveals the centrality of race in American society. It reveals that whiteness, even enemy whiteness, conferred privileges that black American citizenship could not. And it reveals the courage of black Americans who confronted this injustice and demanded change. Today, when we tell the story of World War II, we celebrate the defeat of fascism. We honor the generation that fought. We remember D-Day, the Battle of the Bulge, Iwo Jima, Hiroshima. These are important memories, but we must also remember the contradictions. We must remember that America fought against racial supremacy abroad while practicing it at home. We must remember that black soldiers fought for freedom while being denied freedom. We must remember that German prisoners ate in restaurants where black soldiers could not. These memories are uncomfortable. They complicate the narrative of the good war, but they are essential. History is not simple. The World War II generation was not uniformly heroic. America was not uniformly righteous. The war was fought for important reasons, but it was fought by a flawed nation that had to be pushed toward its ideals. Black Americans did much of that pushing. Black soldiers and veterans demanded that America live up to its promises. They pointed out the contradictions. They organized. They protested. They risked their lives not just against foreign enemies but against domestic oppression. And they won victories, incomplete and ongoing, but real. The story of German POWs being treated better than black American soldiers is a story about injustice. But it's also a story about resistance. It's a story about people who saw injustice and refused to accept it. It's a story about courage in the face of oppression. It's a story about demanding change when change seemed impossible. Corporal Trimmingham could have stayed silent. He could have accepted the situation. Many people did. But he spoke out. He wrote a letter. He told his story. And his story became part of a larger movement that transformed America. That's the legacy. Not just the injustice, but the response to injustice. Not just the discrimination, but the determination to overcome it. Not just the contradiction, but the demand that America resolve the contradiction by expanding freedom rather than restricting it. When we remember World War II, we should remember all of it. The victory over fascism, the courage of soldiers, the home front mobilization, and also the segregation, the discrimination, the contradiction of German prisoners eating in restaurants where black soldiers were refused. We should remember because these memories teach us. They teach us that freedom is not given. It must be demanded. They teach us that injustice does not disappear on its own. It must be confronted. They teach us that ordinary people can change history when they refuse to accept injustice. Corporal Trimmingham was an ordinary soldier. He did an ordinary thing. He got hungry and tried to buy food. What made him extraordinary was that he refused to accept the injustice he witnessed. He told his story, and his story helped change America. That is the power of speaking truth. That is the power of refusing to accept contradiction. That is the legacy of the black soldiers who saw enemy prisoners treated better than they were and decided that this injustice would not stand. They fought two wars, one against fascism abroad, one against racism at home. They won both, though the victory at home took longer and remains incomplete. But they won because they refused to quit. They refused to accept that America could defeat Hitler while embracing Hitler's racial theories at home. They demanded better, and America slowly and reluctantly became better. Remember their struggle. Remember their courage. Remember that when German prisoners could eat in restaurants where black soldiers could not, black soldiers did not accept this quietly. They protested. They organized. They demanded change. And they got it. That is the story. That is the legacy. That is what we must remember.